Everyone. My name is Rachel Lohman. I'm one of the associate pastors here, and it's great to be back with all of you. I'm excited to be teaching for the first time after being on maternity leave and becoming a mom. And I just want to say a quick thank you to those of you who have checked in on us and prayed for us and brought us meals. We have really, really appreciated it. It's not been easy recovering from a C-section. You know, the first couple weeks I had to have Mark put my shoes on. So thanks for praying for him too. And just checking in on us. We have loved being parents to our little Parker, who is now 8 weeks old. But at the same time, it's been really hard. So we appreciate your continued prayers too. So this morning, I have the honor of wrapping up our series through the book of Acts. And I don't know about you, but for me, this has been a series that has been both really insightful and it's been helpful, but it's also been very convicting just to see how radical the early church was in terms of living out their faith and living in real communities together. So before I go into our passage for this morning, I wanted to set the stage with a little video, so we'll go ahead and watch that now. So what's going on there is they are poking fun at something that we call Christianese. It's like this language of all these insider church lingo and terms, I see some of you nodding your heads, that Christians like to say. Maybe some of these phrases are even in your vocabulary, and that's okay. But actually, a funny side note is, I think it was like on our third date, Mark and I stayed outside of my apartment. We were sitting on the curb and we watched this video and a couple others like it till like 2 a.m. We just thought that they were so funny. So that's what pastors do for fun. So, we may not often think twice about conversations that sound like that or phrases, but have you ever wondered what some of those things sound like to an unchurched person? Like, it might almost sound like you're speaking a different language. Just imagine if someone walks up to you and says, how's your week been going? And you say, oh, it's been great. Like, I'm just on fire for the Lord this week. They might think, okay, like, are you really on fire? Do you have a temperature? Like, that's an odd way to describe how you're feeling. Or another phrase that we use often in worship is like, come flood this place. Well, if somebody walks in here for the first time and they're hearing that, they might be a little scared and probably hoping that we have flood insurance. But some of these phrases, while they're funny, I think they can create challenges that we aren't even aware of when we go out to share our faith and engage in conversations with people who aren't following Jesus. And yes, we should be on a regular basis engaging with people who don't follow Jesus. So, I think the whole point of evangelism and being able to share our faith and to break it down into terms that make sense to the people we're talking to is hugely important. And we're going to take a look at that this morning. And there's one person who went out of his way time and time again to talk to people about who Jesus was in a way that made sense to their culture, to their life stage, to the season that they were in. We see some examples of him using really sophisticated terms when he would talk to intellectual people. And then just days later, he's using very common language to talk to an everyday person like you and me. This guy was brilliant at his ability to contextualize the gospel. And I'm talking about the Apostle Paul, who we've kind of seen the chronicle of his journey through the early church, as he was one of the most influential leaders of it through the book of Acts. And Paul could so brilliantly contextualize the gospel. And to contextualize something simply means to put it in its context or to be able to adapt it to the environment of the people who are going to hear it, adapt it to its surroundings. So to give you an example, if I was going to announce that I was pregnant, and I'm not doing that right now, I would announce that message differently to a group of adults than I would to a group of 5-year-olds, right? So I'm going to describe that differently. I'm going to use maybe different emotions when I share that news to match the audience and what's appropriate. Now, my message isn't going to change. I'm still announcing the same thing, but the way in which I communicate that is going to be appropriate for the audience so that they can hear and understand it. So that's just what contextualization means. So we're going to see how Paul does that so well as he makes his journey through Athens this morning. So go ahead and open up with me. If you're using the free gray Bibles, it'll be on page 772. and it'll also be up here on the screens. So we're going to be in Acts 17 today, and we'll start in verse 16. We read that, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. So we'll pause there for now. So to set the scene, Paul is in Athens, and Athens is in Greece, and Athens was the Mecca of culture in that part of the world. Athens was known for its architecture, its art, its intellect. It's where a lot of philosophers were gathered. And so Athens was a very influential city. And one thing that set Athens apart and made it so unique was that they had all of these temples and various idol statues throughout the city. Most of them are still standing today. And so while it was, magnificent from an architectural standpoint to see all of the structures in Athens, the first thing that Paul realizes when he gets to Athens is all of these idols that are everywhere in the city. And he's pretty concerned about that. He sees that Athens is a city submerged in idolatry. They actually take their name from the Greek goddess Athena. So they are literally built upon idols. So that's the first thing that we hear Paul mention. And then we soon learn, thanks to Luke, who's the author of this book of Acts, how Paul felt about that. And we read that Paul felt greatly distressed when he looked out and he saw this influential city taken over by idolatry. It's almost like his soul is kind of revolting within him because he just knows these are God's people who are created to worship, but they are worshiping false gods instead of worshiping the one true God. And so Paul is very much right in feeling the way that he feels. In many ways, he is mirroring God's reaction to when his children are caught up in idolatry. And we see all throughout the Old Testament examples of God being righteously angered with Israel as they are just in this cycle of worshiping various idols instead of worshiping God. And so Paul wants to do something about that. And I think it's important to look at what Paul could have done with his reaction. He was not happy. He was really troubled inside about the sin that he's seeing of the culture. And Paul could have separated himself from the culture, or he could have hated on the culture. He had the choice between separating or hating. And if Paul was to separate, that means he would have, retreated and said, no, I'm just gonna stay among people who believe what I believe because it's safer. An extreme example of separatists would be like the Amish community. Or on the other hand, Paul could have chosen hate. He could have just said, I'm gonna sit back and I'm gonna criticize these people and I'm gonna condemn them and I'm just gonna hate on them. And the problem with both of these approaches, which I think is often the temptation of the church today, is that neither one of those seeks to engage with culture. And if we're not engaging or stepping into culture, then we are missing our opportunity to transform it and to bring Jesus into a culture that desperately needs him. After all, that is what we are called to do, to be salt and light, not in places that are already light, but in the midst of darkness, like Athens. So Paul uses what he's feeling to fuel his mission. And I just think that's so important that we get a hold of that Paul is using what he's feeling to fuel his mission. So what does he do? Well, we read that Paul talked to 3 people groups in Athens. So in verse 17, it says, he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. And that a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. So Paul talks to 3 different distinct people groups about the gospel. The first group that he talks to, we read that these are the religious people, the God-fearing Greeks. And they were in the synagogue. And so Paul is sharing the gospel with them, probably in terms that would be something that we're used to hearing. So they were religious people. They have a faith background. Then the second group that Paul talks to is it says he's in the marketplace day by day. And the marketplace there was called the Agora. It was sort of like an outdoor farmer's market or a mall. And Paul is talking with just average, everyday, ordinary people who are out buying their groceries and things like that. And for them, he has broken the gospel down, and he's using something called Socratic dialogue. It simply meant question and answer format. And that was the normal way that everyday people would talk to each other back in that culture. So think of it kind of like Paul is doing street evangelism at a mall, except he's probably pretty effective at it. And then the last group that Paul talks to is this group of philosophers. This would have been the most influential people in that society. They're highly intellectual. They are brilliant minds. Okay, so he's talked to the religious people, the everyday people, and now he's talking to society's elite. And we read that there were these two groups of philosophers there, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And I'll just give you a little bit of background about how both of these groups perceived God, because I think it's important that we understand how the gospel would have sounded to them. So the Stoics, they believed in something called pantheism, which meant that they didn't think that God was a separate conscious being, but that God was in everything, that everything was divine. So like this podium is divine, and these notes are divine, and this dress is divine. So it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around, but basically they didn't believe that God existed like as a person, as a separate being. And the Stoics, the way that they got through life was just to endure suffering. They didn't have anything like hope or the possibility of redemption. And so they just kind of had to toughen up and get through life. They were emotionless. That's where we get the phrase stoic to describe someone who doesn't show a lot of emotion. And then on the other hand, we had the Epicureans, and they believed, they were deists, so they believed that God existed, but the problem is that they thought that God was far off and absolutely disengaged. He had nothing to do with their world or their personal lives. It was almost like God created this watch, and he spun it up with all of its working parts, and then he set it into motion just to run its course, and he had nothing to do with it anymore. That's how they viewed God relating to the world. So, when they start to hear about Jesus and the resurrection, we read that they began to debate with Paul. And in verse 18, it says that some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Hopefully none of you are thinking about that about me at the moment. Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they call Paul a babbler, which the word that they're using in Greek is an Athenian slang word that meant he was like a scavenging bird. He was a seed picker. That's what it translates to. They're basically saying that this guy has nothing new to say. He's just borrowing ideas from other schools of thought, and everything that he's saying is foolish and silly almost, because the talk of the resurrection would have been so foreign to their mind at that point. And I love what Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, we've studied a lot of his materials through The Prodigal God, what he has to say about the mere fact that Paul chose to engage the gospel with these philosophers. He says that simply because Paul chose to present the gospel to this highly intellectual group shows us that he believed the gospel was big enough to meet their needs, and that it was compelling enough to trump their philosophies. And when I heard that, I just had to pause for a second and ask myself, how many times have I, without even really being aware of it, not stepped into an opportunity to share Jesus with somebody because I had a seed of doubt that maybe he wasn't going to be compelling enough for their life, or he wasn't going to be relevant enough to meet their needs. It was just something to think about. So up until this point, Paul's in Athens. He's shared the good news of Jesus with 3 different people groups. And what happens next? Let's pick up in verse 19 here. It says, "Then they," referring to the Stoics and the Epicureans, "took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking and listening to the latest ideas. So they bring Paul up to this place called the Areopagus. And the Areopagus was this hill that was situated in the middle of Athens. And it's where the council met and their court system would come together for important meetings. And what's really unique and cool about the Areopagus is it was this hill that when you were on top of it, you could see a 360-degree view of Athens. And so actually, when Mark and I were in Athens last spring, we got to go up to the Areopagus. And so I brought some pictures just to kind of give you a visual of what Paul would have been looking at. So the first picture that we'll pull up here, that literally is the hill. That's the Areopagus. So you see those steps behind where those girls are sitting, and that is what you would have walked up to. That's what Paul walked up to deliver this message that we're about to look at. Okay, we can go to the next one. This would have been Paul's view of Athens. So you can see there are buildings there, you can see the geography, and if you were to be there in person, you can actually see some of the statues and the idols there. Go ahead and flip to the next one, Armand. This would be an example of one of the idols that was built, a statue. Okay, the next one. And this one, this is the biggest, most notable landmark. This was the temple to Athena, and it would have been directly behind Paul. This is like what you see on the postcards from Athens. So this was a big deal that this temple was right behind Paul at this time when he's giving this message. And go ahead to the next one. Hope that's me on Mars Hill on the Areopagus. And the last one, that's just some really good-looking guy I found there. And I was like, "Can I get your picture, sir?" That's my husband, for those of you who can't see in the back. And actually, that inscription behind him, that is the Greek of Acts 17. So it's just really cool as you see people from all over coming up to this spot. And I would imagine a lot of them, not even Christians, but they recognize the significance and the weight of Paul being here to deliver Acts 17. So that's, I think, just so important to understand that when Paul was giving this message, he is literally looking in the face of this culture's sin. He is face to face with these idols and surrounded by these temples. And so as Paul is up on top of this hill, looking over the city of Athens, here is what he has to say to them. And hang with me because he's got a lot to say. He says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship." See what he's saying? You're not even sure what type of gods you're worshiping. And that is what I'm going to proclaim to you. This is what I'm going to proclaim. That the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. So there he's getting at their false view of God being far off and distant. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man that he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." And at that, Paul left the council, and some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. So what has Paul done here? Paul has taken the gospel message and put it into terms that were relevant and made sense to this audience. How do we know that? Well, Paul is quoting their own poets, their own philosophers. That would be like us today, like quoting somebody like Taylor Swift, if we were trying to engage with somebody who had no church lingo or background, but they knew culture. So Paul is quoting their own philosophers here. And another thing that scholars point out is that this is the only speech in the book of Acts where the Old Testament isn't quoted. So Paul leaves that out, because those were Jewish scriptures, and he's speaking to a Greek audience. So what Paul has done here is he has understood who he's speaking to. He knows his audience, and he has entered into their world to communicate the good news of Jesus Christ to them in a way that they would have understood and heard. And Paul, I think that he makes his whole life as a follower of Jesus about doing this and doing this well. He writes in another one of his letters to the church in Corinth about kind of his life mission statement to contextualize the gospel well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he writes this, and I just want you to look at all the examples that he gives of basically what he's willing to do to enter into the world of people who don't yet know Jesus. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. So to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law." A lot of laws there. "To the weak, I became weak." Why? So that he could win the weak. "I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means," Paul's willing to do whatever it takes so that some would be saved. "I do this all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings." I think we have so much to learn from Paul in terms of how you and I share our faith today. One of the first things is that Paul met people where they were at. Paul built bridges to his audiences instead of building walls, instead of separating, which would have been pretty easy for him to do. But instead, he built bridges. He found the common ground. I even love how he starts out that speech by saying, "I see that you people are very religious." He's finding common ground with them. And then he slowly starts to shift them back to the fact that they could be worshiping a God that really would fulfill them instead of these false gods. So Paul built bridges. And I think what we see from Paul all throughout the New Testament is that he had freedom in the way that he communicated the gospel. And I think so easily we think that in order to share our faith that we have to have a formula, or we have to follow these certain points like it's outlined for us, or that if we don't quote the 3 right scriptures that the gospel's not going to work on somebody's heart. But we see from Paul that he had freedom to share the gospel however it was needed to reach his audience. And I think that when we get into the thinking that we have to keep the gospel presentation like this neat little script, we are actually limiting God's ability to be communicated in other terms. But what Paul shows us is that Jesus, he's big enough to be communicated in any culture. And that the gospel, that it's compelling enough to go into another person's world and to grab hold of their heart. So what we learned from Paul, both in Athens and how he lived his life as a follower of Jesus, was that we have the freedom to share the gospel in whatever language, so to speak, we need to in order to reach the lost that God has put in our life. I mean, to give you a couple examples of why contextualizing to your audience matters, I mean, would a church in Compton be effectively reaching their culture if they sang old English hymns every Sunday? Probably not. You know, my guess is that they have some elements of their culture, their music, urban art that reflect their audience and build a bridge to them. Another example is, you know, if I wanted to go down to Artesia High School to share my faith with some high school students that weren't followers of Jesus, you know, would I whip out my notes from seminary and use a bunch of theological terms on them? No. that wouldn't be appropriate to that audience. The message would fall on deaf ears. So one of the first things that you need to be able to think through when you're contextualizing the gospel to your audience is to ask yourself, like Paul did, what are the idols of my environment? What are the false gods of my workplace, among my friend groups? To think through, say you work in the corporate world and you're in business. I think a false god of the marketplace is success. Not that there's anything wrong with being successful, but success is often used to build people's identity. So they think, okay, when I accomplish X, Y, and Z, and when I climb the corporate ladder, that gives me my sense of security and identity. They worship success. Or I've been thinking through a new context that I'm in among other moms. What are the false gods of motherhood? And I think one of them is perfection. Just this striving to stay in control and ahead of the game and be able to master things and compare and stack up well with other moms. So ask yourself, what are the false gods among the people that I'm with? And to be clear, you don't need to be like Paul necessarily and be able to communicate to every single people group and switch languages and all of that stuff. Like, don't let that intimidate you. But what's most important is that you're able to communicate your faith to the people that God has put in your path, your friends, your social group, your workplace, your neighborhood. Do you know the false gods of those environments? Because when you do, you can share how Jesus meets the shortcomings of those false gods. So if I was to share my faith with a coworker in business, I would say that you can have freedom in your identity as a child of God, and it has nothing to do with you closing this next business deal or how much money you're bringing home. And there's freedom for you in that. Or to fellow moms, or what I need to tell myself is that I don't have to strive for perfection because Jesus lived a perfect life so that I could find rest in him and through that. So once we identify the false gods that surround us, we can share how Jesus meets that need that people group is really looking to satisfy. Let me give you an example of a story I recently encountered. So a close friend of mine who loves sharing Jesus with anybody that she comes into contact with, she was going to have the opportunity to talk about her faith and just have a conversation with another woman who wasn't a follower of Jesus. And this other woman was going through a hard time in her marriage, and it looked like she's headed down the path of divorce. And so my friend called me, and she's like, hey, this is what's going to happen, and I'm really excited, and here's what I'm thinking of doing. I'm going to sit her down and I'm going to say, hey, I don't want to spend a lot of time just gossiping or talking badly about your husband. And I don't want to hear about the drama of divorce and marriage problems. Like, I get it, but I just want to talk to her about Jesus. And just tell her that, he's the answer she's looking for. And if she could start walking with the Lord, that he'd be able to take this burden from her and help her to forgive her husband. And I'm going to invite her to church. And because I knew this woman well, I was able to kind of speak into the situation and to say, hold on, let's slow down a bit. The best thing that you can do is to meet this woman where she's at. The best thing that you can do is just sit down and listen to her and let her talk to you about whatever is on her heart. And then once she is done sharing, you can share from your own personal experience, how has Jesus helped you through similar times of hurt and struggle? How is Jesus the husband that this woman is looking for? Talk about his faithfulness, talk about his patience and his love through your own life. See, because the gospel is big enough, we have freedom to meet people's needs first. We can listen to them. We can enter their world. And Jesus can be communicated through that, absolutely, and probably most effectively. And to be clear, The gospel message, it does not change. It hasn't changed in 2,000 years. It's still the best news that we've ever heard and the best news that we ever will hear, amen? But the way in which we communicate it, it can and should change. Case in point, Paul. I think that this message, this chapter in Acts, what it should really cause us to do is to ask ourselves, are we looking actively for opportunities to be able to share our faith, the good news of Jesus Christ, with people that God has placed in your life? Are you actively looking for opportunities to do that? Do you know your audience? Do you know their needs? Do you know the false gods and the temptations? And do you believe that Jesus is big enough and relevant enough to meet their needs? And the last point, and this is why contextualization matters, is because this is what God has done for you and for me. And what I mean by that is God sent himself through Jesus to be in our world. Jesus was fully human. It was God with skin on. And God entered our world full of brokenness and sin and human limitations and suffering. Why? So that he could be among us, so that he could meet us on our terms. And what did Jesus do? He dressed like everyone else. He spoke the language that they understood. He ate like the other people in his world did. He took up a common woodworking occupation. Why? Simply to be among his people. And to show us then, just as he does today, that he is the answer to every need and longing that we have. And because this is what God has done for you and me, he has contextualized himself in the form of Jesus for us. I mean, don't you want other people to experience that? Because I think if the gospel has really gotten to your bones, if you really, really get what Jesus has done for you, then you will be compelled to go out and to share your faith. And you won't be scared by the fact that you might have to step into uncomfortable situations, or you might need to learn a new language, so to speak. But you will enter the world of your friends and your coworkers and your teachers and your neighbors in order to share Jesus with them. Because that's what he did for you and for me. I just think about how Jesus left the early church with this commission. He said, "Take my news to the very ends of the earth." And they did that. They were passionate about that. And that task, that mission is left with you and me today, is to continue what Jesus started, what Paul started and executed, what the early church did so well. And it's up to us now to take this gospel message to the ends of the earth. And how are we going to do that? Well, friends, we're going to enter the world of people who don't yet know Jesus. We're going to go to the lost that Jesus has put in our life. And we're going to share the gospel on their terms through meeting their needs. We're going to show them that Jesus is the one that their heart longs for. Because that's exactly what Jesus did for you and for me. So I'm going to invite the worship team to come back out now. And as we respond through a couple of songs in a time of worship, I just want you to ask God, who are those people? Who are those people that you have shied away from sharing your faith with for whatever reason? And ask for boldness to be able to do so. And perhaps this is a moment that you need to spend maybe confessing and just sharing your heart with God and saying, yeah, God, there have been times when I didn't believe that you were enough to satisfy the needs of the people around me. And so I backed away. It's okay. He can take that and ask him to show you and remind you that he's enough, that he's big enough. He's compelling enough. So as we respond, there'll be an opportunity for you to take communion in the front or in the back. And if you're unable to move, someone will come around to you with a tray. And as you take communion, you can be reminded of the sacrifice that God made on your behalf through his son, Jesus Christ. And we have candles over here that you can light to symbolize the light of Christ that you need for whatever darkness is real in your world right now. And I'm also going to invite the ushers forward to collect our tithes and offerings, just as a reminder that we don't worship the idol of money here. Money is not our God. Jesus is. So as we respond, I just invite you to open your heart to Jesus in whatever way he's speaking to you. I'll go ahead and invite the ushers forward at this time.